Hello, everyone. My name is Andres Jaque, and I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation here at Columbia University. And welcome all of you to this very important lecture that GSAPP is hosting with Lydia Kallipoliti. And we're incredibly happy that Lydia is giving today the open house lecture that for us is a very special moment and more meaningful than ever at a time that, of course, we feel that our community is under attack in a way, and we're, as a community, feeling or living difficult moments, but difficult moments that are not making us not focus on what our mission is and what we believe that is important in our work, in our discourse, in our research, in our practice, which is a very important way for us to say what we're thinking now. But I want to say that along these lines, I'm incredibly honored that Lydia is a member of the GSAPP community, both as an associate professor, member of the faculty, of all the discussions, of everything that happens here, but also as the director of the AED program, the Advanced Architectural Design program, which is a fundamental part of the school and one that actually has in many ways contributed to the evolution, not only of the school, but actually the disciplines of the built environment across the world. And Lydia is incredibly unique in many ways, and we can already see that in her trajectory or training or education with a diploma in architecture and engineering from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece, a Master of Science in Design and Building Technology from the MIT, and a PhD in History and Theory of Architecture from Princeton University. This incredibly complex situation, academic and professional and disciplinary situation, is exactly what makes Lydia so valuable for our community and for the entire world, I would say now, in what it regards to the built environment. But she's also both a historian, a theorist, a scholar, but also a designer and an engineer, and that reflects also in the fact that she is the founder of the design and writing studio Anna Cycle. Her books are everywhere, and when I say everywhere, it's really everywhere, and they have influenced not only architects, but actually I would say a broad spectrum of professionals, of scholars, of publics that have been shaped and changed by her work. And the Architecture of Closed Walls, or What is the Power of Shit, that was published in 2018 by Lars Muller, together alongside with Storefront, I think has changed radically the way we think of materiality and its intersection with social, ecological, political questions in ways probably that no other book has done in the last decades. Actually, not only us, this is the book that Mike White chose to be the reading for Albi Di Grasso in the second season of White Lotus. And as you know, this is not by chance. All these people in this kind of close environment of the Four Seasons or the White Lotus hotels contemplating their own decade and kind of material cyclability were reading these close words of What's the Power of Shit while they were going through these difficult moments in Sicily. But I think that's definitely not an accident, and as we know, there's, if you Google it, you will see how many pieces from The Guardian to Atlantic have been discussing the very specificity of the books that Mike White has chosen. Lydia is also the author of the section of the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Environmental Science dedicated of the history of ecological design, one of the first accounts really of how design have engaged with ecology seriously in the last decades. And that was also in 2018. And that, I guess, was the basis of a major book, Histories of Ecological Design, an unfinished cyclopedia published in 2024 by Akhtar, that is, I would say, the reference to what has been the journey through ecology in architectural design in the last decades. Lydia was also the editor of Eco Redux, a special issue of Architectural Design magazine in 2010. And she's the author of more than 50 articles and research papers published in magazines and books, including Log, Architectural Design, Praxis, Journal of Building and Writing, Domus, Volume, R+, Future Interior, the Cornell Journal of Architecture, Threshold, 306090, Pidgin, TGE, Architecture in Greece, Buildings and Landscapes, the Journal of Architectural Education, chapters in books. For me it's unique is that Lydia is someone that is published in journals, in peer-reviewed journals of scholarly work, and at the same time working in design magazines like Domus. And that's, for me, what makes her work incredibly unique. She's also a curator, her 2022 curator alongside Areti Markopoulou of the Tallinn Architectural Biennale with the theme Edible or the Architecture of Metabolism was game-changing and was finding an amazing perspective to discuss ecology, looking at that through the way bodies would be connected to each other. I was very honored to be invited to this Biennale, and I would witness the impact that it had. But I want to reflect a little bit of what I think makes Lydia's work so unique and what also makes it so relevant and impactful in our fields. For me, Lydia's work, it's very much showing the indivisibility of discourse and theory, practice and design, and science and technology. I'm not saying that these are fields that are connected. What I'm saying is that they are needed. Each other needs the others. We cannot do a relevant theory without observing carefully and being interrogating what happens in the design processes. We cannot seriously be thinking about theory if we're not observing design as a critical field where many questions are addressed and many possibilities of inquiry are activated. In the same way, I don't think we would rely seriously on what design is, and we would understand what design is, if we wouldn't understand that it's informed and also inseparable from things that are happening in the realm of theory. If the conceptualizations that are happening in theory are not somehow infiltrated design. And definitely these are also practices, fields of inquiry that are inseparable from science, from technology, from techniques. So for me, the first thing that I want to say that it's making Lydia's work so relevant and the reason why it's so impactful is that these realms that often are segregated in separated pockets in her work are claimed as indivisible. The second I would say is that Lydia looks at things, not as at abstractions. She's really looking at particular fecal matter, and by looking deep into the fecal matter, she understands that it's connected to trains, to environmental injustice. It's reflecting how societies are constructed and are also opening the door for these societies, these territorial divides, to be addressed. When she looks at membranes, when she looks at the closed world, she's not looking at them as an abstraction, but she's looking at specific cases, at the trajectories that happen through them, at the little stories, at the holes in the membranes, at the moment that the systems collapse. She's looking at them not as, let's say, general ideas, but rather as very tangible and mundane realities from which we can extract theory and activism and politics and knowledge. And I would say that in her work, the social is not previous to the material, not kind of an abstraction or relational abstraction, but a form of metabolizing togetherness. This idea of the social as something that is materially informed and physically constructed is something that, of course, takes or leaves behind many of the notions of the social that are not capable of understanding what's the role of design and materiality in the making of relationships. And I think this is also the question about politics. Here, the politics are not the politics of the spoken words which is incredibly reductive, but rather how politics are the collective production of life. And there again, design has a key role to play and much more capacity and agency to intervene. And of course, that's inseparable from words, but words are enacted through design, through materiality, through spatial calibrations, through technologies, through pipes, through photovoltaic pieces, through bacteria, through shit, right? This design is not in her work, design is not scrutinized through the intentions of their authors. And this is also very important. She's not looking at what architects were saying alone, but what she's doing is actually scrutinizing complex assemblies of human and more than human entities where corporations, activists, public agencies, machines, bodies, air, earth negotiate their collectiveness through messy, accidental, and unpredictable processes. And that's what makes your work so needed, because they give you the length for you to really engage with this level of complexity with what design, technology, materiality, the built environment is now. Okay, I could stop here, but I want to make sure that also we acknowledge that Lydia is everywhere and has all the credentials. She's been in the Venice Biennale, and she's actually already, again, participating this year in the Istanbul Design Biennial, in the Shenzhen Biennial, in the Oslo Architectural Triennale, in the Onassis Cultural Center, Lisbon Triennale, Royal Academy of British Architects, Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, London Design Museum, Milan Triennale. She's got awards everywhere, silver medal of the W3 International Awards for Digital Innovation and Environmental Awareness, the 14 Webby Awards for the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences, grants from the Graham Foundation, mentions from the Shenzhen Biennial, the Mervyn Goody Award for the creative use of materials, Fulbright scholarships, awards from the Architects newspaper, many Lawrence Anderson Award for the creative documentation of architectural history, NYSCA grants, Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, High Meadow Sustainability Fund, ACSA Award for Creativity Achievements. And well, I could go on and on and on and on, but I think it's also very important to say that this is something that is not me saying it, but she has all the credentials. Lydia is unstoppable, and there's recognition to everything that I said before. So we're incredibly happy to have you here, being part of our community. We're honored that all the work that you're doing is connected to what happens here. We're very happy that you're directing the Advanced Architectural Design program here. And it's the moment to go in depth into your work and have the opportunity to discuss it, which is our way to celebrate, discuss, and ask more and more and more. Following the lecture, I will be in conversation with you, Lydia, and there will be a Q&A that will be open to everyone here, and there will be a reception for everyone also participating here in the audience on the 400 level following this with drinks and food, so we will keep discussing with Lydia. Please join me welcoming Lydia Kallipoliti to this open house lecture.
I know you expect me to say very important things after this incredibly moving introduction by someone that I have admired for so many years. I'm incredibly honored to be part of this position, super thankful and moved by the introduction. And the first thing I want to say is congratulations to all of the admitted students. We're so thrilled and happy to have you here with us. And I'm going to, at the very end of my talk, I'm going to say why we're here, hopefully. Listening to you was very moving, and I'm a little shocked it was like an obituary. But I hope I'm okay, and I will be with you directing the program for a few years. So I'm not leaving. To the students that are admitted in the AAD and in the other programs, welcome. So I always like to begin my talk by this diagram, which I really love. It's not mine. It was done by an anarchist architect called Graham Kane in 1972. And he was part of a group in London called the Street Farmers, and he built this, I would not really call it a house, it was more like a shed, an outhouse, which was an inhabitable living ecosystem. But what's very important is that in the diagram, the form of the house is completely absent. Instead, all the systems are working together in tandem, and he's in the center of the system pooping, hence the power of shit, which we're going to discuss a little later. But what is really important is that it becomes a coalition of different material interdependencies where materials exist only in phases, and it gives us a very different definition of waste. It is not a phantom material condition, an invisible one, that we can relate to the management of urban resources, but it infiltrates habitation, the air that we breathe, and the water that we drink. It is intricately enmeshed and involved with the dirty physiology of the body and weaved into the ecology of habitation. So to me, that was a really fascinating moment in the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s, where the first ecological houses were living communities and experiments and not measured objects. So it was a time where the shift to the epistemic dimension of metrics, which is now the currency through which we assess the world, was really not at place back then. So, but it was really a living experience where the house needed from the inhabitant constant maintenance or care. Failure to maintain the biological systems, or rather to care for them on a daily basis, resulted in all the components kind of crumbling and affecting the many other energy and resource system contingent to it. This is a drawing that I did. I always, when I find an archive, it soothes me in a kind of form of therapy to redraw it. This was a drawing about the autonomy discourse of that time and ecological systems as living communities that I included in one of my most recent books, Histories of Ecological Design. But this reality, which can be illustrated, can also become represented in different ways. It can become a system of flows and metrics and materials. This is a flow chart that I did to document the outputs of human bodies when I was preparing an exhibition on closed worlds before the book that Andres mentioned came out. And it really shows that bodies are active material entities that spread materials in space. They also spread biometrical data through different kinds of machines that document our existence. So it gives us, it portrays inhabitants as inseparable parts of a building ecology, and currently this image is dismissed. Environmental concerns promote mostly ethics of scarcity and lists of cautionary practices, but weaving the ecology of bodies into the ecologies of habitation is something that I'm very interested in exploring. So if we compare that almost engineering representation with this representation, this comes from psychoanalysis, we can see many similar traits. This is a very, very old diagram that I did as a student, like you, like many of you, in 2004, more than 20 years ago. And it was mapping the theory of a Hungarian psychoanalyst called Sandor Ferenczi. He used to work with Freud, and he wrote a text called The Ontogenesis of Money, where he basically argued that shit and money exhibit two sides of the same coin. Shit is ejected from the body and rejected by the psyche, whereas money is introjected by the body and accepted as a highly desired form. But both entities derive from the same prime matter in a process of serial transformations that shit assumes different material states all the way to money. So in this sense, and this is a kind of representation of his theory, materials only exist in stages where they absorb qualities from the previous stages. So mud is shit deodorized, sand is mud dehydrated, pebbles are sand hardened, and coins are pebbles unearthed. So recycling shit to money is as much a subject of theoretical analysis as it is a factual constituent of capitalist production. Waste needs to go away, and the very process of purging, transporting, and carrying waste into oblivion is something very profitable for those who carry it. And to give you an example, I use the image of this train, which is going from New York to Alabama every day and expels all of New York's fecal matter to, not all of it, some of it is processed in Newton Creek, but the one that is remaining is travels through this train, which in jargon they call the poo train, causing major stink methane clouds 900 miles away. The treated sewage, euphemistically known in the industry as biosolids, travels with this train, and when it is deposited in these areas of disenfranchised populations, it is called the death smell. So since the Environmental Protection Agency decided in 1988 that it was not a great idea to dump sewage and shit into the oceans, where to put a metropolitan environment's fecal matter is a constant challenge, and it is a very big question on how to export waste, where to export it, and what are the economies, the cheap land that can receive it. So while the displacement of shit from New York to Alabama is highly curated, it transfers the problem to disenfranchised terrains. So therefore, the question of how we deal with waste, how we understand how to retain it, how to process it, how to decompose it and redistribute it, is not just a technical problem. It doesn't really involve machines, factories, and resources and infrastructures. It is a matter of justice and equity, because all of these things get deposited to territories whose populations do not have the power to fight legally against this kind of strategic deposition. So retaining waste on site and designing infrastructures on how to live with our excrement is an opportunity to get that, despite the upfront cost of investing in spatialized infrastructures, may have a lot of geopolitical consequences. So moving forward, I will present maybe 3 different kinds of projects, and I will start with presenting a series of research projects that deal with waste, and the first category will focus on other bodies and the ecology of habitation. And I will mostly focus on bodies that somehow defy or resist the idea of the well-shaped man. I've always been super skeptical of the Vitruvian men and modular and kind of like how architecture constructs certain human subjects, and it is built for certain subjects to inhabit it. And in that light, the bodies that we will explore in these projects are defying perceptions, Western perceptions mostly, of beauty, balance, and harmony. And I will start with this project, which is called Life on Mars, and it was conducted in collaboration with a cluster of genetic engineers at the University of Technology, Sydney in 2020, right before the pandemic, and it was commissioned by the London Design Museum. And my original reaction when they invited me to create this really big infographic based on actual data that the genetic engineers would give me, I had a very contented relationship with it because Mars' narrative of exploration is entirely subordinated to the history of colonization, where different power structures establish their dominion. I was more of, like, along these lines: Mars sucks, the Earth. And this is something, I really like this billboard. It was actually put up near Elon Musk's SpaceX headquarters on Earth Day of 2021. And I was like, why would I do this? Mars does suck. I live on Earth. However, I found a different way into it, and I thought it was extremely interesting to explore it in that light. The research on life support systems of Mars is very meaningful in a different way, not as an escape for a privileged population, but as a drive to project new ways of living on Earth. Research on life support systems on Mars forces us to face our conditions, our shitty conditions on Earth, where resources for sustaining all forms of life have been abandoned for the most part since the Enlightenment. Only recently have we been mandated to consider their finite worth or replacement and deal with excessive waste generated as byproducts of daily production processes. On Mars, where every resource for sustaining life is precious and rare, waste becomes integral to survival. So this view from afar changes our viewpoint on how to retain it and recycle it. And when we start putting ways of life together on inhabiting another planet, we basically speculate how to live in inhabitable digestive machines, in giant vessels of ingestion and excretion. These types of living machines display beyond function modes and trajectories for existential change. Traditional dichotomies and distinctions like inside and outside, body and building and environment are systemically transfigured. Understanding how to design spaces for these kinds of non-distinctions depends on the regenerative properties of synthetic biology and our ability to engineer and tinker with resources and materials. In designing these kinds of digestive machines as inhabitable living spaces, the premise is that humans can coexist with the material consequences of their bodies. So the project is also an attempt to reinvent the engineering flowchart, this kind of diagram that I was showing on bodies with the orange boxes, which is used for portraying and illustrating regenerative life support systems in a series of boxes and arrows. If the abstraction of this kind of representation were to be removed and redrawn with prescriptive and formal detail, it would evidence that machines that convert these types of materials are not black boxes, but they can become spatial elements with adjustable and complex morphologies that accommodate biological and programmatic needs. So in this space, which is a toilet/garden space, feces are separated from urine and digested in an integrated toilet garden and a social auditorium space. Human excrement becomes nutrients for soil and produces methane to power a hydroponic/aquaponic garden. So foreseeably, such possibilities could urge us to reinvent the politics of our territorial dimension. Different kinds of spatial alliances between a bioreactor and a bathroom, a kitchen and a laboratory, a bed and virtual reality, a dome and spaces of entertainment. So moving on from Mars to Earth, these kinds of ideas and questions can be explored in projects on Earth. These kinds of conversions that we can think of resources that can become part of architectural languages and tectonic languages that will help us investigate the climate crisis through lenses of energy generation and distribution. The ways in which we can decentralize the supply of energy may transform environments and power relations. So in this project, little installation in Shanghai, we proposed a mobile food cart functioning as a digestive system that collected sewage and other forms of organic waste from the city, reprocessing it into drinkable beverages. With this little vehicle, we explored speculative ways in which parts of the built environment may become subject to cultivation, harvest, and consumption. The cart had 3 sections, each dedicated to digesting and recirculating a specific substance. One was for coffee, the other one was for herbs and tea, and the other one was for algae. and different kinds of potable beverages were produced through systems of recirculation. The byproducts also of one process were redirected as inputs for another. Coffee grinds became fertilizing nutrients, water drainage from the hydroponic system was input for algae growth, and biomass was used as biofuel. So this was an experimental project that it remained on a level of illustration, but all of the tests we're currently processing some of the findings into potential applications. Going again to a different project, this was a series of drawings that I did during the pandemic for the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, where everybody was staying at home, and it was a kind of almost global confinement. And the drawings, because nobody would go to museums, were printed very large scale and on walls of the city, and they could also have projections on them. So due to the ubiquity of domestic containment at the height of the pandemic, we focused on the hysteria, tightness, and confinement for the privileged part and fraction of the population that was able to confine themselves at the stay at home. In this particular drawing that you see on the screen, every drawing focused on one type of domestic space. It was called Eating and Bathing, and it demonstrated the fragility and limitations of food supply chains and the ways in which we may envision alternative microenvironments where food can be produced via recirculating resources. And here, interior plant-based phytoremediation, microbial mats used for water filtration, and other microbe-activated filtration media may enable us to coexist with other organisms and develop multi-scale and multi-species spaces of interaction. But I would also like to point out that drawing was, in this case, an inquisitive method of production. It was not just an illustration of an idea, but it was constituted of different fragments of objects of history that I found important, or I found in archives that somehow coalesced in this drawing. So in many ways, I'm interested to how to use within the act of drawing visual forms of narration that become like citations, kind of equivalent to the way that in a text there are citations. A drawing can also have citations, and the compilation of it is not ahistorical, but it's mostly transhistorical, crossing different types of time, different types of drawings with citations, and providing also an archive where existential ideas about the world migrate between different places and authors. I also believe that by using different tools that we so often, and that our thoughts are not just shaped by our own beliefs, but by the tools that we use, the languages that we speak, and the stories that we have inherited. In this drawing that's called Cleaning, we see the obsession of confinement with details in the home and the propensity to remove dirt at all costs from all surfaces of the house, yet dispensing with physical labor. And this was very, very present during the pandemic. And with Roombas and other automated cleaning service robots, the compulsive need to remove dirt has fostered an industry of global surveillance by collecting personal data across homes all over the world. So it's very interesting to think, if you have one, like who collects these kinds of plans from your house of the Roomba, and what they do with that data, with all of these patterns of surveying how one may clean a house, and all of the kind of systems of these seemingly friendly companions that are part of our lives but monitor daily biorhythms of so many people. So domestic machines, the seemingly friendly companions, address not just our individual desires, they also fabricate them by constantly monitoring and surveying the enclosed subjects, us, our biorhythms, and daily living patterns. And this was another drawing, Sleeping, that visualizes the scientific management of sleep, evidenced in smart devices that are commonly used to analyze patterns of health and provide useful feedback. You should sleep 8 hours or go to sleep now. And at the same time, this continuous monitoring allows all aspects of life to be quantified, commoditized, and monetized. So the mapping of each household contributes to a global surveillance map of biorhythms, living patterns, and personal usage data. Our personal impressions are no longer our individual choices. They're footprints of larger information aggregates collected by synchronized domestic environments, recorded by the Roomba Corporation, by Amazon, and others. So the intention of reinventing these kinds of processes is a tool of resistance. How to create a world unsubscribed to the persistent monitoring of biorhythms and personal data. I will move a little faster to the next question, which is about scholarship and immersive scholarship. What do I mean by that? And the debris of your own research. And very often I use archives as a form of research, and I use past ideas or things that I find in archives through a very big catalog that I compile. This means for me, it's an ideological position that in the history of ideas, discourses get recycled, concepts emerge as new, but they're not new. They undergo long journeys of migration from different epistemological fields, and the cycling of ideas is also a form of resistance to the linearity of discourses and the causality to respond to current problems and find solutions immediately. Recycling becomes a disruption to the idealized continuum of time and the positivist cause and effect logic, or a productive distraction to the arrow of time. So in many projects, I examine, redesign, and reimagine archives that are not static objects that contain historical documents, but they are immersive spaces and living collections where ideas mix in different time zones. History is, for me, a creative and generative medium for contemporary concerns in design, education, and practice, one that does not just require us to publicly engage with certain moments of time, but also makes evident that there are cycles in the way that ideas propagate in the world. So a project that Andres spoke about that evidences that a little bit is this book that I wrote in 2018, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? And it's interesting because I wanted the book, the first page was a kind of proper title, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, which is very much, let's say, in alliance with Rainer Banham's The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment in 1969, and the architecture of, you can find like maybe, I don't know, so many books with that. So that gives it credibility that it's not, but The Power of Shit is ugly, and it was in the subtitle. And Lars Muller was very keen on having an ugly subtitle. And I thought that the topics that were included, it's not just about making a genealogy, but really making counter arguments to how histories of ecology have been viewed and seen, and how the idea of closed world involves shit on many levels. So before that book, the project was an exhibition at the Storefront for Art and Architecture. That was the first iteration. This is in 2016, and each person could inhabit a 6-foot diameter for each project of the case study. There were other ways to navigate the archive, that was a living archive, and somehow 6 feet became the personal bubble of distance in the pandemic. People thought that it was prophetic, but it was not. It was random. And this is the highlight of my life, I guess, when that Andres pointed out, when for some incomprehensible reason, the director of White Lotus picked that book. Maybe it was because of the shit, maybe it was because of the closed worlds. It's definitely not bedtime reading. And when I saw it, I was very surprised, and I just really laughed with my kids for a very long time. He also took it to the beach, and that was another really interesting moment for me to discover where a book could go and what it did to sales, which was really an interesting other story. Anyway, going back to reality, it was a very important. It was not a book that I needed to write this book. It was not something that I did to get tenure or anything like this, because the stories were so diverse. They were representing antithetical political agendas, but they were governed by similar principles. And they tell a story of contained microcosms with the ambition to replicate the Earth in its totality, a series of living experiments that forge what I tentatively called a synthetic naturalism, where the laws of nature and metabolism are displaced from wilderness to cities and buildings. So this, the idea of a closed environment is really not new. It's linked to the history of utopia. This is a tiny installation by Hausrecker Co. It was on the cover of Casabella in 1976, and it was a little art piece that was exhibited in Cologne in 1972. And it's an iconic illustration, but people were using it. But what's interesting is that inside is Marc-Antoine Logier's primitive hut. And by the time that, let's say, an archetypal object of education, like the primitive hut, goes in a jar and is sealed, it becomes a fossil. It becomes something that has died, and we have to investigate its death. And this is what was really interesting to me, that the idea of nature as a wild territory has already died by the time that it's within this jar. And this is something that was really interesting and starts a whole process of reconstruction, or how architecture may produce nature. But in many ways, closed worlds are not just about utopias, and they're not speculations. They're part of the everyday. And even though here you're seeing one of my favorite movies, Jacques Tati is someone all architects love, or most architects love, it becomes a profitably real scenario of everyday environments in the workspace. And our indoor environments today are actually politically charged spaces that reflect social ideas and culturally specific standards of taste and judgment. Confined in artificial enclosures, environmental control has enforced biased standards of life, even though in most cases, these standards institutionalize absurd criteria that homogenize ideas of comfort and well-being for the entirety of the human race. So in many ways, closed worlds are not just physical environments, they are power structures that maintain and manage constancies over bodies and psyches. And I always like, because I'm such an engineering geek, I always like showing a very early psychrometric chart, which was done by John Carrier from the Carrier Corporation. And it is how engineers identify in most buildings thermal comfort, a concept that was of thermal equilibrium that was just started to get traction in the 1950s, sequester comfort zones held within narrow ranges. So comfort is within the red and the yellow line. Even though bodies experience comfort in so many different ways, the idea that this is where we are as bodies and spaces is something applicable. And since the 80s that it was institutionalized by Israel it is something that is implemented in most environments, most kind of large corporate spaces. So in the book, I argue that the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering has been strongly linked to the conceptualization and production of closed systems. As partial reconstructions of the world in time and in space, closed systems speak to the eerie transference of life, using architecture as a medium and a vessel to secure a compulsive cycling of matter, energy, data, and capital. So there were many ways of investigating that. This is a historical cross-section to analyze all of the different case studies in the book, the exhibition in Storefront, transferring the exhibition in Sydney, Australia in 2019, and also many levels where something that I couldn't show in the series of case studies, I would show in this very large poster called the Minor Histories, which includes in the very middle different human subjects that were constructed within closed worlds, like an exoskeletal man, a nominal man, a digestive man, and so forth. And they were always men for some reason, which we can debunk right now. But in the texts and the archives, there were men. And the words that could not be analyzed properly within the book, there was a whole series of words that came from engineering, but they become so important. So I was really thinking while I was compiling all this information, why as architects do we only know poché, or we know terms like about the thickness of orthographic projections and drawings? It's so important in the way that we build, the way that we analyze and occupy the world, to know what is acclimatization, which is the geophysical adaptation of the body to different climatic conditions. So a lot of these words were compiled in an online lexicon, which you can find online, and that was another byproduct of this project. But I think that one of the main things that I was interested in the book throughout the case studies was the idealization of circularity, which I think is a deeply rooted problem of deduction in environmental representation, which is almost visualized exclusively with the use of arrows. So if you think of how to represent the flow of resources in a drawing, most people use arrows. And that comes from a very specific kind of cybernetic language that Howard Odum used for ecosystems. He was a microbiologist, but it was founded on electrical circuits. As architects, so since the 60s, he developed, Odum, the Energess, the energy systems language, which was instrumental to ecosystems as well as human agency. So the world was regulated through input and output. And this representational language for ecological simulation models has become the primary tool for architects to visualize performance and energy flow. However, there are different options, I'm hoping, of different fields that can reflectively replace arrows, given that arrows only point to the end goal of conversions, but say very little about processes of thermodynamic transformations. So the Chilean biologist Francisco Varela argued that cognitive systems cannot be understood explicitly on the basis of their input and output relationships, but by their operational closure. So the language of environmental representation represents a process of threads, while these threads and processes are trying to develop relationships with themselves. In the environment, perception is seen as a cognitive process of hypothesis formation, not as a simple prescription or reflection of pre-given information. So going on to a different kind of this project, this is a recent book, and I will really not stand with it for very long because I'm hoping to do a book presentation next year about it, because it's being translated in 2 different languages right now. And I'm hoping to do a presentation about it in the future. but I will say that it's a very long book. I called it a cyclopedia and not an encyclopedia, and it spans from the 19th century to contemporary practice in 21 chapters, including intersecting design ideas and their encounters with ecology, policy, law, and governance. An objective was to decolonize notions of environmentalism and open the framework to not just a historiography that includes disenfranchised populations, but also disenfranchised narratives. Because it doesn't have field work of covering those under-examined geographical areas, but it really has a critique and reassessment of values of how ecology started through German naturalists going out to fields. And it starts with an acknowledgement and a critique that ecological histories reflect in one way or another hierarchical modalities of domination, ones that are bent on controlling knowledge and shaping the physical and material world into ontological and scientific worldviews. Architects and designers have been complicit in the hubris of the position that we are caretakers of this world as distinct biological and individual entities, and that we possess a sublime power to analyze the world, create hierarchies, and construct ideological cosmologies that become norms. So the histories that are outlined, first of all, they're not ordered only chronologically. They are unapologetically in the plural form, and these are different threads of ideologies and worldviews that one can link from linking one chapter to the other. So if you link, for example, let's say, the acclimatizers with climaticists and with resilience, you will get a history of the acclimatization project. And it's very important to write in a way that doesn't necessarily espouse the linear way in which texts are provided, also reflecting the ways in which knowledge is constructed and consumed and digested by a younger generation of audiences that really can't read a book from beginning to end. And that's not surprising to me because I do it all the time. I see my kids do it. And I think there have to be new ways and new forms of addressing this that somehow invest in the complexity of thinking and narrative through the form of the printed matter. At the same time that I was writing this book, I was doing an exhibition of it at the Cooper Union, where I was a professor for many years before coming here. And these are drawings that I've constructed for each of the 21 chapters that are compilations of different archival sources that are put together for each chapter. So today it is critical to acknowledge that ecological design is a deeply rooted extractive colonial project. And as Andrea Branzi argued in the 1970s, nature is not necessarily a physical entity or simply a neutral and free structure, but a great and general product that must be wrapped up to look like a perfect image of itself. So these are more images of this tiny exhibition. So why was it a cyclopedia and not an encyclopedia? Because I argued that the process of cycling knowledge is significantly different from encircling knowledge. Cycling denotes, in many ways, a feedback loop of ideas and practices that travel in distinct orbits with different points of semantic gravity. It also suggests a journey rather than a singular perspective, and voyages between different times, places, and objects. When a chapter is part of a cycling process, we cannot be sure of whether it speaks of the past or the future, since in the history of ideas, discourses get recycled. On the other hand, encirclement is a mental and political construct that allows all things to be incorporated into controllable and determined worldviews. So was the Vitruvian Man, or the climatic man that we just saw that Victor Olgier drew in the 1950s. But the circle is not a given figure on which power acts. The very task of political action is to encircle and transform knowledge, organic life, and bodies into sovereign entities and instrumentalize them as modes of discourse and hegemonic power structures. As Ukrainian mineralogist Vladimir Vernadsky noted in the 1920s, if an organism is studied as something different from the cosmic environment in which it is a part of, then it is not a natural body as it is, but a pure product of thought and ideology. So these ideas have also, the third, let's say, way after writing and designing is curating. And it comes from archival research. But this was a kind of project a biennial that I curated in Tallinn, Estonia in 2019, prepared during the pandemic, where the question of where our food comes from became very important. It brought to the forefront the fragility of our production processes, the mobility networks that transport commodities and food, and it called for new forms of localization and the design of circular economies. And in that project, many faculty of GSAPP participated, including the Dean Andres Hake, who did an incredible kitchen that went to other museums. And here you see in the picture the installation of Professor Lola Ben Alon, who built edible bricks, a periodic table of bricks that could be eaten or used to build with. The concept of the exhibition was based on a large-scale habitation system that we called the metabolic home, where visitors were asked to participate in a curated experiment. There were 7 installations and exhibited how metabolic processes related to food were linked to everyday domestic spaces and activities. Within the metabolic home, we were interested in the house as a microcosm of the world and a test bed of how resources could be recirculated. So producing food was presented in a vertical robotic garden, processing in an interspecies kitchen, ingesting in a rewilded dining room, digesting in a lounge with an edible outer envelope, hydrating in a toilet that recirculated and filtered water, breaking nutrients in a vertical terrace for harvesting, upcycling in a garage made of carbon-negative voxels. Each domestic space was part of a larger ecosystem that interacted with the other parts of the house in a feedback chain of resources. And let me just play this video just to show you a little bit about this project and a performance that we put together on its potential habitation during the opening of that event. And the best part was that a lot of the exhibition was eaten right after. So I like to use, in ending this project, a kind of quote from Anand Singh, who's an anthropologist that I read and I love her work. And she prompts us to think that in our current world, contamination is collaboration. We are contaminated by our encounters. They change who we are and the way we make for others. As contamination changes world-making projects, neutral worlds and new directions may emerge. Everyone carries a history of contamination. Purity is not an option. One value of keeping precarity in mind is that it makes us remember that changing with circumstances is the stuff of survival. I also want to say that for me, research, practice, and teaching are completely inseparable and intertwined. And many of the projects that are happening in the studio or have happened before in my life in studios are developing into research projects that I work with students after they graduate and so forth, or during their graduation. So this is an example of an installation that we did in 2018 as a material experiment for the second lives of bottles. And it was a disaster relief shelter made from interlocking plastic bottles, as the plastic bottle is one of the most important consumer byproducts that becomes a natural catastrophe for oceans. This is it. But we're linking these kinds of installations with this reality. And this is basically a kind of zoomed out version of understanding the Great Pacific Gyre, the coagulation of plastics in the ocean that have degraded and coagulated in gigantic plastic islands and have become new forms of artificial territories that are not just geographically located as a space in the ocean, but are also part of bodies of birds, of seashores, and also of our bodies as well. So, and this is a kind of representation of the Pacific Gyre, and within that reality, we have new objects like this one, which is a plastiglomerate. And it is a specimen of the age that we live in, where the dichotomy between what is natural and what is artificial no longer exists. It is no longer viable. This is fused organic with inorganic matter. And these are diagrams of recycling that the students at the first stage of the studio were looking into. But they worked very closely with this bottle that was patented. It was a kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, and they developed different kinds of prototypes. So this was a module for water biofiltration system. This was a packaging system for including the bottles, which would unfold and create flooring for these disaster relief shelters. Apparently, flooring was, if one would talk to disaster relief organizations like the Red Cross, they would tell you that flooring is much needed in creating disaster relief shelters. And the packaging system was envisioned also as a floor component. But also we used the same items to create light switches, to create solar beads that would collect energy and be able to be switched on and off for lighting, like you see here. This was the team back then, and the same prototype was transferred to different venues, but also became a kind of component of K-12 education experiments. And then spearheaded different kinds of projects for me, which it was not in collaboration with the students, but it was an exhibition at the Oslo Triennial called Message in a Bottle, where different bottles included microscopic messages. These are all the kind of messages on the architecture of degrowth, and these were images of how reducing plastic pollution or understanding plastic pollution can impact the future of the climate crisis. And this was the installation that was exhibited at the Oslo Triennial of 2019. Other times, research that the students undertook in the studio, this is a drawing of a student particularly, which was really about enclosure. It was again during the pandemic, the fact that there's an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency statistic that says that even before the pandemic, we spend 90% of our times indoor, and the indoor environment is something very regulated. So with everything that I kept saying things about the psychrometric chart, and the student kind of created an environment, a drawing that combined the psychrometric chart with an environment. And then the idea of confinement became a constitution of microecologies in a fragmented assembly of interiorities during the pandemic. So we generated these kinds of drawings on each one's house, which was a collective of our studio during the pandemic, and what kind of material processes. We all had sensors in our rooms and monitored the presence of certain ingredients like nitrogen dioxide and different spores, air quality, humidity, and so forth. But we also created maps that don't only involve material measurements, but also kind of created a new kind of psychogeography of confinement, where things like density, income, and air quality became regulating factors to understand a new kind of space in urban environments. And these kinds of models were then I made these kinds of models that were then included in the Venice Biennial of 2021. And kids really like them. They're trained, so I guess it's kind of expected. So I want to end with something very general, but it also has to do with everything that's going on in the world. And I want to zoom out of my own work and my own lens of seeing the world, because I'm only here, I step in the role of others that have preceded me, and I'm only here because of people that have guided me and inspired me for extended periods of time. So we are nothing if not a part of a community, and this is a very dense and vibrant community with imperfections, turbulations, stellar thinkers that I have admired for so many years before I even came here, that come together in very small rooms, because this is New York City, and we are part of a larger, we exist in a context, and this is a very turbulent context right now. We always exist in a context. We're not separate from the world. We're threaded into it, and through history's ecologies and the matter of others, we are part of all the turbulence. And our greatest strength is that we're always situated. We are made of soil, sweat, plastic, and politics. In this messy world where fundamental acts of freedom are threatened and questioned, when higher education is attacked and called to mute its agency, we are called not to purity, but to respond, to show up, to entangle with care, to imagine otherwise, to be present. And we have to address everything that is going on through the work and with the work, rooted in this idea of a beautiful, damaged world. We are here to do what we can with what we have and the time that within the time frame that we are given. How change is affected is a very complicated question. It is not just crippled by bureaucracy and technical difficulties embedded in systems of production and communication. There are tremendous political and economic forces at play which deeply impact decision making. But pessimism is not an option, neither is fear. We have a responsibility with the work that we do to understand how technical problems are political, what is our agency through the work that we do, and how we can enable and resist to acts of threat that are upon us. And we have to imagine, we have no choice but to imagine and strive to different futures that do not rely on the extractive exploitation of resources and the perpetuation of racism and inequalities. So this is my last slide. It is a representation of space debris. So it shows from 1957 to approximately today, approximately our time, how we have exported massive amounts of waste outside of the Earth, which is going to be in perpetual orbit. And it shows a kind of dark age because it kind of is in a way, but we cannot naturalize the darkness of these times. Like Jacques Derrida argued for the evolution of language and culture, which is not given, but it is instead constructed through historical and social processes, recent developments of severe environmental degradation, and the erasure of certain identities is sometimes seen or is asked to be seen as natural and inevitable. It is naturalized as the default mechanism in the evolution of societies in their technological and cultural advancements. This distortion of the problem is why critical discourses in design, education, research, and practice are vital to all of us to reform and rebuild new alliances and hierarchies. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and thank you for being here.